Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
With the new Mortal Kombat movie now streaming on HBO Max and playing in select theaters, we're looking back today on the history of movies based on video games. Why are so many of them, well, terrible? And is there a better future for these console-to-multiplex adaptations? We'll get into that and more today with the help of a special guest.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, folks, thank you again for joining us for another episode of Film Club. If you've been listening regularly to the show, you know that over the last month we've been talking about the Academy Awards. Well, those happened. They were this past weekend, and so now we are moving on to a different topic of discussion. Thankfully,
a different type of film.
Very much so. And I will say also, I am relieved that we do not have to find a new way to talk about Nomadland.
Yes.
I feel like the two of us have kind of exhausted that film and maybe a few others over the course of...
Yeah, between TIFF and theatrical and Golden Globes and Oscars, you know, it's lucky there's a lot to talk about. But yeah, there's not an infinite amount to talk about.
That's right. So if you would like to know our thoughts on the various awards contenders this year, including the winners, we covered most of them over the past month and also somewhat over the past year, honestly. Today we're going to talk about films that are not award winners generally. Maybe ever, actually.
Yeah, I can't think of a single one that like even got nominated for, you know, like an effects Oscar, like one of the kind of, you know, consolation prize Oscars.
I'm sure somebody is going to, like, at some point will chime in with a chime in the comments or something and say, well, you forgot about this technical award that so-and-so won. But honestly, I don't think so. I don't think... we're talking today about video game adaptations, and I don't think a single one has ever been up for an Oscar. And there is a reason for that, and it's not simply the Roger Ebert school of snobbery against video games. Before we get into that, I'd like to introduce our very special guest today. He is a contributing writer for the AV Club. He's also our games editor. William Hughes, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dowd. Thanks for having me on. Hi, Katie.
Hi, William. Yay.
Thank you for joining us today, man. When we first were like, we're going to talk about video game adaptations on the show. It'll be a nice break from Oscar talk. I had one person in mind, and I'm glad you could make it.
And I think you are right that no video game movie has ever been nominated for an Oscar, and that you are also right that is for very good reason.
It actually seemed like this year there was a very tiny chance that it might happen just because of the sheer dearth of Hollywood movies in contention.
Sure.
And there was some talk that, like, maybe Sonic will be up for visual effects, and I'm very grateful that it's not.
Yeah, we'll talk about Sonic later.
So William, you host your own podcast, is that right?
I do. It's a silly comedy podcast that I'm always terrified anyone from work will listen to. So.
So I promise not to listen to it, but can you tell the listeners what it is? And
Sure. It's called Everything to Guppy. It is a sort of 15-minute improv comedy podcast in which me and my friend Gary Butterfield discuss all the items from The Binding of Isaac, a video game that is completely ridiculous to describe to other human beings because it is about a crying baby trying to kill his mom in a basement with biblical overtones.
Is it a fun game?
It's extremely fun. I've played, I think, 800 hours of it at this point.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
What do you talk about every week?
Well, the game has a huge number of power-ups in it. There's something like 800 items in it. So every week we just take one of the items and use it. We talk about it in the game, but it also, just because Gary and I have a particular energy, it tends to turn into absurdist improv very, very fast.
Got it. So where can people listen to that?
It's part of the Duckfeed Podcast Network, so you can find it there at everythingtoguppy.cat. Guppy is a cat in the game. It's all absurd. It's all nonsense. I always feel weird talking about it. But that is where you can find it.
All right. Well, I've promised not to listen, but I don't know if I can keep that promise. So even though I will probably have, if I do listen, I will have no idea what you're talking about. I've never played this game, but...
On multiple levels. It's also kind of... It's very Scott Aukerman-y in that we have a lot of fun with like anti-comedy. So like new content just came out for the game. So obviously to celebrate that, we released a commentary track for the movie Nothing But Trouble.
For the whole movie?
Yeah.
That's very funny. Well, I'm really happy you're here with us today to talk about this. The big question that we're going to be getting into on the podcast today is, and I'm sorry in advance if I offend anyone who may be fans of any number of these films. But let's face it, the reality is that most video game adaptations, like on a whole, they are not good. And I think we're going to get into an answer later, or some theories as to why we think that's the case. Just kind of wanted to introduce that up top, and also clarify before we get into it further that we're mainly talking about Hollywood adaptations here. The ones that make it to the big screen, or in the case of the new Mortal Kombat film that is out now, that you can watch on HBO Max. But I know there's a vast library of video game adaptations for, well, there's some for television for one, but there's a whole line of direct-to-video video game adaptations. There's Japanese animated films that I think probably don't even ever make it over here to the States. William, do you have any experience with any of that vast library of content?
A little bit. So obviously, like, one of the big entries here is Pokemon, which the TV series of Pokemon began running basically as soon as the games came out, and there are films based in that, and they're huge. In terms of, like, there's a couple, like, interesting live action adaptations that were made in Japan that have never made their way over here. There's the one I've always wanted to see is that Takeshi Miike made a adaptation of the Ace Attorney Phoenix Wright games, which looks completely amazing, because those games are very silly. They are lawyer games where you often put, like, ghosts on the witness stands. And it very much feels like he tried to capture that vibe and that look, and I've always wanted to see it.
I mean, I feel like Miike is one of those guys who, and I think we'll talk about this more later too, but he is a filmmaker who I get the impression some of his work is inspired by the aesthetics and some of the concepts of video games as well.
Yeah, and then there's things like things that are specifically made to promote games. I think the most famous of which is probably Final Fantasy Advent Children, which was a big deal when it came out, which is a full-length feature animated sequel to Final Fantasy VII. I mean, it looks amazing and is good on the merits of a sequel to Final Fantasy VII, but is very much outside, like, the Hollywood apparatus.
I'm imagining, though, many of those are a lot better than the films made by the Hollywood apparatus out of video games, you know?
I think almost certainly, because you have a lot more direct involvement from the people. They're not, a lot of times you're, like, directly adapting things from the games and interacting with the games in a way where there's no attempt to distance yourself. And maybe one of the things I'm going to hit on when we talk about why game adaptations are so bad is that there's a certain upturned nose element to the creators of it. And I think that is not an aspect that is at play as much when the studios are very directly involved with these.
Yeah, I do think that's a big part of it, actually. And I'm glad you brought that up, and we will talk about that, because I do think there's a kind of, when Hollywood tackles these projects, I think there's a general kind of who gives a shit attitude about them, because it's like, well, we're making these for the most indiscriminate audience or something, you know?
Mm-hmm. Right. Like, we have this name, we don't have to try.
Exactly. If Mario is in it, people will come, that sort of thing, you know?
Right.
Yeah. So what is everyone's here's background with video games themselves?
I've been playing video games since I was 5, and the number of days of my life where I haven't played something are probably less than 100 since then. It's my primary hobby. It's how I relax. I'm more likely to play a video game than watch a movie or watch TV, although a lot of times I'll do both. I will not describe myself as a gamer, because that is a quote unquote cultural term that has picked up a lot of baggage over the last 10 years. But I do love video games, and I do have a lot of faith in them as an art form that can do a lot of different things.
I loved seeing last year when you did on Twitter, you did like a countdown of your favorite games, and it was fascinating to me to see it, because it reminded me a lot of in film critic circles when if you watch a lot of movies as a film critic, your tastes are going to be more esoteric than the average person's. And I'm going through yours, and I'm seeing tons of games I've never even heard of, and seeing some of my favorites slagged off, you know, in the same thread, you know. But then understanding as a critic that, like, my particular taste in video games is not going to be as nuanced as yours, you know.
You were on the other side of the mirror for a minute.
Exactly.
Down.
Yeah. I was like, wait a minute. The Last of Us Part 2 was great. What do you mean, William?
It has good parts. I agree.
All right. Well,
I'm a crank. I can own the fact that I have certain contrarian tendencies that have been pointed out to me by people in my life that if I say they're wrong, I get yelled at. So,
well, to be a critic, I think you kind of have to be to at least some extent. Because otherwise, I mean, what role would we really serve if we were just constantly repeating this conventional wisdom on everything,
Right. Yeah.
Katie,
you'd be a publicist.
Exactly. You'd be a glorified publicist,
Yeah.
Katie, what's your background with video games?
Well, I'm so glad that William's here. This, to me, is a fun exercise in the sense that I was not allowed to play video games when I was a kid. My parents fell for the moral hype that video games rotted your brain and were a waste of time. And so I was not allowed to get a Nintendo or a Sega Genesis or anything like that. So all my experience with video games is either playing them in someone else's house, like I can play like Super Mario level Super Nintendo games because, my cousins had an SNES. And then in like high school and college, I used to watch boys who I was dating play video games a lot. So I'm a cultural tourist in this area, and I'm just excited to like hear you guys talk about it.
Well, it's okay because I think we have kind of a spectrum here because I think I kind of fall in between the two of you. I do play video games, but I don't play them religiously, and I don't play them a lot necessarily. I usually play a couple of new games a year, but mostly it's comfort food for me. I mostly play things that I know I like already. I sort of have the relationship to video games that bugs me about other people's relationships to movies, where I'm like, there's so much out there. Why aren't you exploring more of it,
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So if you want to talk about video game movies, you have to really the whole genre goes back to really the early 90s. And the first again, and we're talking mainly about Hollywood films here. We're not going to get into the tons and tons of films made in other countries and the tons of animated films made. We're talking mostly about Hollywood's relationship to video games and how they've gone about adapting them over the last couple decades. But again, if you go back to Hollywood's the origins of Hollywood's relationship to video games as IP that they can develop, you have to look at sort of the early 90s and a few films that came out then. The very first sort of big screen video game adaptation was maybe quite predictably was Super Mario Brothers. And within a couple years of that, we also got movies based on Double Dragon, Street Fighter, and Mortal Kombat. Now, I saw Super Mario Brothers in theaters when it came out. Did either of you see Mario at the big screen Mario Brothers movie at that time?
Oh, absolutely. 9-year-old Will was there opening weekend, I think.
That movie has developed a cult following over the years, as almost everything old eventually does, a strange movie from your childhood will at some point become championed by someone in the world. And I feel like there are those now who sort of celebrate that film as a kind of spectacle of weirdness. Even at the time, I was sort of like, this is not much like Super Mario Brothers, is it?
Yeah, it's one of the most discussed films of like that era. I think there's been a lot of like retrospectives and looks back at it. Sorry, because it's such a weird production. You have the directors of Max Headroom trying to adapt Super Mario Brothers as a sort of cyberpunk trash punk dystopia with Dennis Hopper playing kind of a proto-Trump figure as King Koopa. It's a bizarre. It was bizarre impulses. Oh, produced by I can't pull his name, but the director of The Killing Fields,
Roland Joffe.
Yeah, it's a very weird coming together of talents who had no real place making a Mario movie.
Yeah, this is one that I definitely saw this like in college, and I was probably stoned when I saw it because I just remember being like, "Oh, Dennis Hopper's King."
It's actually very hard to see today, at least through streaming purposes. Unless I'm mistaken, I actually don't think you can stream it anywhere.
It is not available on streaming. No,
that's so bizarre.
I tried in the lead up to this. I tried and could not find it anywhere. So I was disappointed by that. The clips. So like one of the the things you can say against that movie is that it's simultaneously trying to be very weird and very childish.
Yeah,
and that kind of those two impulses do not work well together. And you can see that if you watch the clips where they'll be like, "Oh, weird fetish gear on people," but also, a fart joke or whatever.
Right. I actually see it as very emblematic of that particular era of adapting sort of, well, honestly, not just video games. I actually see it, there's a real parallel between early video game movies and earlier comic book movies, I think, which is that Hollywood sort of looks at these properties and says, well, name recognition is all that's really important here. People will come see it no matter what. And there is absolutely no fidelity to what people like about the original thing. So you see, and I feel like we saw a number of comic book movies in the 90s that had, that bore almost no resemblance to their source material. And that's very true of some of the early video game adaptations as well. Street Fighter is another big one, obviously. I remember seeing that in theaters as well. And just the degree to which that does not remotely capture. It's like they took all the characters who are in Street Fighter 2 and threw them into the movie, but made like E Honda in this version is like a cameraman, Mm-hmm. And they were just like, well, we just got to make sure we get all the characters. It doesn't actually matter if they resemble the fighters that people are playing in the video game,
Yeah, and like with Street Fighter, if there's something great in that movie, it's basically incidental to them casting Raul Julia.
Right. Yeah, Raul Julia in, I believe, his final role, which is really sad. He plays M. Bison, the big bad of Street Fighter 2, anyway.
Very famously, I think, said publicly that he basically took it to give his family one last paycheck, as he knew he was dying, I think.
Man, that's super sad.
Wow.
That's a super sad
performance
footnote.
in it, though. But for me, it was Tuesday.
Isn't Kylie Minogue in Street Fighter as well? Doesn't she play Cammy? Right?
She's playing Cammy. You got Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile. That's the interesting thing about this early wave. They're not necessarily cheap movies.
Right. And they're not boring either. They're insane, I think, a lot of the time, but they're not boring,
Yeah. With the exception of Double Dragon, which I think is not an especially fun movie. But
right.
Mortal Kombat, Super Mario Brothers, Street Fighter, they're going for something. They're not going for adaptation necessarily, but they are going to be kind of big, fun movies.
Right. I do think, though, that the lack of faithfulness to the text is something that would change dramatically in the way that Hollywood started approaching these coveted, let's just say it, sort of nerd-courting pop culture properties over the years. And now, obviously, with the connection to comic book cinema, I mean, you now look at there's a lot of when Hollywood goes about to adapt a comic book property, there is an enormous amount of thought put into like how faithful are we going to be to this text and how many references can we slip into this. And it was really a different time in the 90s. And I do wonder, do you think that video game adaptations have gotten more faithful to the text over the years?
I think you can kind of break it down to certain periods. So we have this early run where it's just like we have the name, let's make a thing. And then you have like a 10 to 15 year period where it's kind of just Paul W.S. Anderson and Uwe Boll.
Right.
Just taking these names and doing whatever they feel like with it. To greater and lesser effect. I know you're a fan of Anderson's movies. To some extent, Dowd.
To some extent, Ignati Vishnevetsky, another AV Club writer, is a much bigger Anderson fan than I am. I have kind of mixed feelings on his work, to be honest, but I do understand the case for him that he is somebody who, an enthusiastic merchant of pulp,
Mm-hmm.
I've been catching up with a fair amount of Paul W.S. Anderson's work because I am like catching up with these video game movies, and I feel like I get him now. Like I get it and I appreciate it, and and it is just the kind of he does the thing that I think a lot of Hollywood adaptations kind of miss, which is that you're supposed to just have fun with the material, you know, and just he doesn't take the material. He takes it just seriously enough, I think. You know, like he doesn't dismiss it, but he doesn't take it as a holy text either, which I think is a good tone for this type of material.
Yeah, I mean, his adaptations, I don't feel like they're not extremely serious films, but there is a real affection for the source material, even if in something like his Resident Evil adaptations, I don't feel like those things are like slavishly faithful to the games either. They capture some of the silliness of those games and some of the set pieces and some of the monsters show up, obviously, but you would not necessarily look at the Resident Evil movies and say these were extremely faithful adaptations of the games, you know?
Yeah, Dowd, I think you're right to draw the parallels to comic book movies. And I think genuinely you can look at like the rise of Marvel and the point where like, oh, we can make $1 billion if we give these people what they want. Mm-hmm. I think that definitely influences the last decade or so of video game movies, especially since, you know, Warcraft was what, 2016, I want to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, Warcraft, not a well-regarded film, but is the most financially successful video game movie of all time. And it does it by taking the story it's trying to tell pretty seriously, and also just by, for whatever reason, being hugely successful in China. But
yeah, it had to have been, because it was definitely seen as a flop here.
No, it made much more money in China than it did in the States.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I wonder why we haven't gotten a sequel.
I'm genuinely not sure, because that movie sets up a sequel.
It does. It's really bad though. It's a really chintzy film in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and then even we're talking successful. I think it made like $450 million. So it is not making Marvel money, but
Only $450 million.
Right. But by the standards of like, is this an Iron Man? Is this an Avengers? No, but it made more money than any other direct adaptation has made. And then you have something like the Sonic movie, which is, I think, fun, kind of fun.
I'm not with you there personally, but
that's fine.
There's one thing about Sonic that drives me crazy, which is that I mean, I don't really care about fidelity to text in a lot of different. Like, I think that it's fine. You can have a video game adaptation or an adaptation of anything that deviates radically from the source material. But with Sonic, it's like, why would anybody want to make a Sonic film where Sonic spends large portions of the movie sitting in a car going
It's
like
amazing.
40 down the highway? I mean, it's basically like a hop.
My favorite moment in that favorite moment in that entire film, to digress wildly, is there is a like on the road fight sequence where they are being chased by robots, and Sonic, because he has god powers, disassembles 3 of them. And then for no reason, James Marsden, I guess, got bored and goes, "My turn," and picks up a stick.
Yeah, I found the whole arc of the movie too really odd, to where Sonic had to prop up this small town cop's dream of moving to the big city, and you know, they talk about action, and I'm like, is this cop like dying to kill somebody? What is he when he talks about how he wants to move to San Francisco and fight real crime? I'm like, read the room, guys. Good Lord.
You have a nice life with your wife and Adam Pally. Just enjoy it.
Yeah. You bust shoplifters and jaywalkers. Like, why are you so eager to, you know, be killing people in alleyways? I don't trust it. ACAB. That's my review of the Sonic movie.
But the Sonic movie is not, I would describe, a particularly faithful film.
Right.
And that's probably the most recent / semi-successful video game adaptation. They took Sonic and dropped him into a buddy cop formula, and it works to the extent that it works, but I still don't think there's a lot of like interest in fidelity. Like, you can look back at something like the Assassin's Creed movie, which is also not good and is kind of boring, but is at least trying to be an Assassin's Creed movie pretty hard.
I was thinking, too, of the most recent Tomb Raider film with Alicia Vikander, and how much that takes its cues from the Tomb Raider reboot, the game reboot from a few years ago. How much both story and visually, it's even tonally maybe, it's borrowing from those games. That felt to me like a genuine attempt to make a faithful video game adaptation.
But I think going back to a point that Katie made when she was talking about Paul W.S. Anderson, I think too much faithfulness in a video game adaptation is not a good thing.
Why do you think that?
Because video game storytelling, even now when we're into a realm when people are trying to be very cinematic much of the time, is meant to service different needs than even a book or a graphic novel that you might be adapting. The storytelling there is meant to, at least in a good game, work with the play and work in service to the play often. And that does not lend itself particularly well to, I think, narrative storytelling, at least, or cinematic storytelling, I should say. There's also always the issue of length. One of the things that when it became my job to play video games all the way through for work is realizing how goddamn long games are relative to most other forms of media. And that condensing effect is very rough on stories, I feel like. A plot beat that plays out once every 45 minutes as you're playing a game does not work in the same way when it has been condensed down into a film where there's maybe a 5-minute action sequence in between.
Well, let me ask you a question then. Do you think that if you were to make a video game movie, like how you, something that you're describing, I'm thinking about biopics, because biopics have the same problem. When you condense a whole life down into an hour and a half's worth of storytelling, you end up going through all the beats really quickly. But something that people do as an alternate method of biopics sometimes is to just focus on one period in a person's life. What do you think that could work for a video game, like focusing on one, like, I don't know, like a particular mission in a video game or something like that and turning that into a film?
I think the problem there is that those missions aren't designed to stand as standalone narratives either.
Okay.
They're supposed to be, it's a storytelling form that tends to have a lot more in common with TV, because you have like these sort of, a lot of times there's an episodic structure where you are shading in more character details, having the events play off of each other. So it's a tricky thing to try to cut out a chunk of a game and turn it into a film.
Okay.
I think the more successful tactic, and this is not a good movie necessarily, but if you look at Detective Pikachu, you are seeing a movie where they took the setting and the world of the Pokemon games, and I think brought it to life very successfully. They bolted a not especially good plot and a not great Ryan Reynolds voice performance onto it, but I think the world of that movie is about as compelling as anything I've ever seen in terms of adaptation.
So in theory, that particular approach could be more successful if more people adopted it.
Yeah, but it's also a matter of picking the right source material. Like a lot of times, if we're talking about like Max Payne, Max Payne is a video game series that exists to replicate cop film, action film cliches. To translate that back into a film just means you're having Mark Wahlberg shoot people.
Yeah, it's just the cliches. No, you're
Yeah.
exactly right. I mean, I had the same thought while watching that most recent Tomb Raider movie, which is that part of the appeal of Tomb Raider as a game, I think maybe if you're talking about any generation of it, any version of the franchise, is that you're essentially getting to play Indiana Jones. You're getting to experience it from a player's point of view as opposed to watching it on a screen. And when you translate it back, all you have is kind of a bad Indiana Jones ripoff, without that element of player involvement.
And that you can go the other way too. Like one of the other films I watched when I was prepping for this was Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, which before Warcraft was the most successful video game movie of all time, which always shocked me when I found out. That movie has its issues. The entire Persian royal family is played by white American and British guys. But that is an example where they took the basic outlines of the video game Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, time travel powers, parkour, rebellious prince, and just kind of made their own movie out of it. And it's a lot more fun than a lot of video game adaptations that I've watched.
Yeah.
Because they are not trying to be anything except taking those very loose points and turning them into a pretty successful story.
What you're describing, now I'm thinking about like how you have Gotham City, right? In the DC world. You have Gotham City, and then you can have all these different types of stories taking place in Gotham City. Is it kind of like that, where the game is sort of, in this metaphor, it's the Gotham City, and then you have like, all these different narratives that can happen within that framework?
I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay.
I think more often than not, the characters and the settings of these worlds are more interesting than the plots that are playing out.
Mm.
And I think that it's in trying to adhere too hard to those plots that you can kind of get bogged down in feelings of being bored or convoluted.
Okay, yeah, this was my problem with the Resident Evil movie. I could very much tell, when you have Mila Jovovich wake up and not know where she is at the beginning, I was like, oh, that's where you start the video game. And I could kind of see the structure of the video game in the movie and in ways that I felt like didn't enhance it as a narrative at all.
Oh, I think that is a complete invention of Anderson's.
Is it?
Yeah, because I don't think any of the Resident Evil games actually begin that way, with you being sort of memory wiped and just dropped into an environment.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
I thought for sure that I was like, oh, okay, so this is how the game must start. Oh, that's interesting.
No, but you're definitely hitting on the fact that Anderson, among the filmmakers who, I mean, and let's be honest, if we're talking about directors who have devoted their careers to video game projects, to making video games into movies, Anderson is sort of the chief figure. I mean, he made the 1995 Mortal Kombat. He directed a number of the Resident Evil films. He recently did Monster Hunter. I think people do kind of tend to hold his Resident Evil films towards the top of if you were to do a ranking of video game adaptations, I think most people tend to really like his Resident Evil films more than a lot of the others. But Anderson is somebody who I think even when he's not being strictly faithful to the property he's adapting, he's still thinking in video game logic sometimes, and I think that the way he structures his films sometimes there's a kind of progression that reminds me of video games, sort of going from level to level,
Yeah, as an outsider, to me, what makes something, a video game movie to me, or kind of a tell that something is based on a video game, is the structure. I feel like video game movies have a specific structure where, like you said, you're moving from level to level to level, and then you meet the final boss at the end.
Very much so. And there are films like, I think of something like The Raid, which those who do not like The Raid, the amazing Indonesian action movie from last decade. First of all, get out. Secondly, pack your things.
Guys, I liked it.
William, pack up. William, finish your drink. Finish it quickly, and then get the hell out. No, I mean, The Raid, those who did not like that film, I feel like the comparison that I saw the most often was it's too much like a video game. And when people talk pejoratively about films that remind them of video games, they usually mean, that kind of a kind of primitive structure that involves sort of waves of enemies and constantly going from one objective to another. Or they're talking about what it's doing visually. They're talking about a sort of preponderance of CGI sometimes, or a look which they are which they are equating directly to video games.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even and some of these films are doing this self-consciously, right? Like Scott Pilgrim versus the World, I know is based on a graphic novel, and I assume that the structure of that is like a video game purposefully.
Oh yeah,
absolutely. That's the structure of that. Was Scott Pilgrim, the graphic novel, was released. Basically, each of the volumes of that is essentially a video game level that ends with the boss fight against the Evil X.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And at the same time, Brian Lee O'Malley is incorporating all sorts of video game logic and visuals into the art that then Wright, I think, very successfully manages to import into the film.
What do you guys mean by video game logic?
That's a good question. It's because the movie that I watched Hardcore Henry before coming on here, which is another film that is very influenced by video games without actually ever referencing video games. There's a simplicity to the storytelling. There are things that work on a certain simplistic logic. I think like the moment in Scott Pilgrim where he grabs the one up is a very obvious video game logic kind of thing. Or even in Hardcore Henry, near the end, he grabs two things of adrenaline and jabs them into his legs, and now he has superpowers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also kind of the instructive nature of it sometimes too, right? I mean, I think Hardcore Henry is a perfect example because that movie to me feels like just basically doing like a speed run of a really violent first person shooter, and I think it's obviously it's designed to look exactly like that and play like that, but there are also elements in it like you have these non-playable characters who keep showing up. In the case of Hardcore Henry, there's one played by it's Charlotte Copley, and he just keeps showing up in different disguises and sort of giving you information. And that to me is very video game logic, which is that sometimes you need somebody to show up and tell you what to do next in a way.
Okay.
And there's a moment in that film where I was like, oh, this is an escort mission. They have where there is a character who is being lowered on an elevator, and the character Henry is running through this building, keeping guys away from him in the elevator. I'm like, oh, this is the structure. This is the objective structure of a mission. There is a clear objective on the screen. He is moving through obstacles. This is formed like a video game level.
Yeah, I thought of the level in GoldenEye, obviously the classic first-person shooter for Nintendo 64, where you have to get who is it, Natalia, from one side of the level to the next, basically, and keep her alive, and she's kind of wandering into the line of fire sometimes. And yeah.
So that makes me think of the movie Edge of Tomorrow, Live, Die, Repeat. And, I feel like that's another way to do a video game style storytelling, in the sense that, he keeps getting these new lives and playing the level again.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not just, it's almost built. The notion that you get better at a game by playing it more and sort of going through a game and failing basically trial and error basically is a big part of the way that some people play video games. It's definitely big to my process of playing video games, which is you go try something, it doesn't work, you die, you do it again. That is built into the narrative structure of Edge of Tomorrow. I mean, it is literally, it's like Trial and Error, the movie. He basically just keeps rebooting and getting a chance to do things differently by learning the patterns of the enemy.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and I think to some extent you can push that out to like any time loop movie to some extent. I mean, by being an action movie in that form, Edge of Tomorrow definitely hits those beats very hard. But you're right, that trial and error, every video game is like Super Mario Brothers is a time loop, if you want to think about it that way.
Yeah.
Because every time you start it, you're starting right back from the first point.
And Groundhog Day is a video game adaptation in that sense, in
Whoa.
spirit, right?
Which then, of course, has been adapted into a VR sequel to Groundhog Day, if you ever want to find out what happened to Phil Connor's kids.
Are you kidding? Are you joking?
Nope.
Wow. I do. Can you talk more about that for a minute?
Yeah, it's called, I think, Groundhog Day, Like Father, Like Son. It came out.
No way.
Yep. Where Phil Connors Jr. is a very angry blogger who comes home to Punxsutawney for his dad's, for the memorial after his dad dies. Bill Murray, not in the game. And gets stuck in a time loop and has to learn to be a better person.
Wow.
Are there clips of this on the internet? Can I watch some of this at least?
I think so. It's VR only, so clips are always a little weird to watch.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not awful because the designer it's a studio called Tequila Works who does a lot of time loop stories and stuff. So they have obviously brought a lot of affection to it, but it is very presumptuous.
Wow. Man, I've heard so much about the E.T. game that was supposed to be so bad, but I've never heard of this one.
I mean, there's a whole reverse episode to do about video game adaptations of films and how awful those have been for so long.
Very true.
Yeah.
It's like neither side gets this right very often, I will say that I do think there has been maybe a modest improvement over the years if you look at video game movies. And maybe what I'm just describing is that they've become a little bit more streamlined and less fucking bizarre than they were at the start, But I do think that what we've seen over the years is you've seen slightly more respectable filmmakers attaching themselves to these projects. Somebody like Duncan Jones, who made the Warcraft movie, obviously. Before that, he did Moon and Source Code. Justin Kurzel, director most recently of The True History of the Kelly Gang. He made Assassin's Creed. Mike Newell, of all people, made Prince of Persia. And we've seen some huge movie stars make video game films as well. Angelina Jolie, Mark Wahlberg, Michael Fassbender, Ryan Reynolds. The Rock is kind of I feel like if you were to pick one actor who is sort of...
like the king of the video game
Yeah,
movie?
Kind of, although his movies aren't necessarily good. So, I mean, Mila Jovovich is probably
She's the queen.
Yeah.
She's made a whole career out of him,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. I mean, the Rock has made a couple. He's in both. He stars in the Doom movie, the very, very poorly received Doom movie, and he's also in Rampage, which is, in my opinion, one of the better video game adaptations, actually. But I feel like even as the pedigree has increased, these movies have remained, on a whole, not very good.
Yeah, I will definitely say that the give a shit quotient has gone up.
Yeah. There's less of Hollywood just being. I just picture like an executive with like an old white bald guy, like Michael Tierney or something, with like a huge stogie in his mouth, just going like, "What are the kids into these days? Mario? All right, get me Dennis Hopper for that."
Yeah, it says Mario on it. Doesn't matter what's in the tin.
We still have Bob Hoskins on contract.
Yeah.
Get him in there.
I don't know why I feel like I'm imagining like old Hollywood when we're describing this 1993 movie, but there does seem to be a lot more, and I think it does have to do with shifting trends in how we are catering to the presumed demographics of these projects. But there does seem to be at least a little bit more desire to like maybe try to approximate what people like about these things in their original format, But William, as you said, that's kind of an impossible task, because the reality is that what we look for in a video game is just radically different than what we look for in a narrative that we have no involvement in shaping,
Yeah, it's a very tricky concept, because it's so easy to look at the story and say, all right, let's replicate the beats of the story. But the story's not what you're doing.
Right.
The story is, I won't say the story is incidental at this point. Video game narrative, especially as people like, say, Hideo Kojima, who made the Metal Gear Solid games, has very explicitly tried to make more movie-like games over the years. At the end of the day, these narratives have to be in service of the game, which means they aren't in service of just being pure narratives.
Right. I feel like very few people love a video game that has a great story but is otherwise a total slog to play, right?
I'm getting yelled at on Twitter literally today for the re-release of Nier Replicant, which is exactly that argument. But
okay.
Fight me, Nier fans.
I have a question. Do you think that maybe the give a shit quotient, I kind of wonder if it's not even so much about giving a shit and more about that like video games now are very immersive and have these hugely detailed worlds, whereas in the past you just had like Mario's in the sky, Mario's in the water, Mario's on the land. Do you think that that's a factor as well?
I think to some extent, the improvements in technology have made it easier to make something that looks like a video game for better or worse. The Illumination is working on a Mario movie, which I am not looking forward to because of Illumination's past output. But if you there was no way, I think, in 1993 to make a movie that looked very much like a Mario Brothers game. It would even that movie had like state of the art CGI technology in it. Like it's still heralded for the technical advancements they made to make some of those effects. But I don't think there was a way at that time to capture, unless you went full animation, which obviously
exactly.
Yeah, people did obviously in with anime especially. Or you can look at Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, which is also an awful movie, and it has nothing to do with any Final Fantasy games, but it's neat looking.
But what I wonder about that, though, is I think you're right that they could have used animation to recreate the world of Mario very easily. Like Disney, could have just been like, yeah, we could make an animated Mario movie. But I think that if it wasn't, if you don't take that step further and make it live action, if it's just animated, I think that the audience might look at it and realize the extent to which they're being given something with a component missing, essentially. You could recreate the look of Mario. You could make an animated movie that looks a lot like Mario. But I think that people would look at that and go and miss the component of it that they actually like about Mario, which is, of course, the gameplay. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's less fun to watch Mario jump on a Goomba than it is to make Mario jump on a Goomba.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
I think so. I think we're kind of getting at some of the reasons why a lot of video game movies have been unsuccessful, or have at least been unsuccessful from our critical perspective, not necessarily from a financial one. I wonder if part of it also is that we have just not seen a ton of really great artists, a lot of really great filmmakers tackle a video game project. I just don't see when these projects get greenlit. I just don't see somebody who is really truly gifted as a filmmaker, or somebody who's ambitious anyway, artistically, going, I want to make that. You know,
it often gets handed off to people working at the, at the start of their careers. It's often that kind of jump off point. Like Mortal Kombat is Simon, is it McQuoid?
McQuoid, I think.
First film. It's a tricky thing, and there's always like rumors that someone with a little bit more clout is going to hop in. Like, this isn't necessarily a film director, but Rob McElhenney from It's Always Sunny was attached to the Minecraft movie that was supposedly being made. Eli Roth is making Borderlands, which, God help us, it's going to be deeply irritating. And then, yeah. I mean, not even my opinion on Eli Roth, just my opinion on Borderlands mostly. But it is a conflation of factors, to be sure. Weirdly, I think the most interesting adaptation that is in the works right now is in TV, and that's the Last of Us TV show that Craig Mazin is making for HBO.
That one does seem like it has the possibility of being something that might be genuinely good, if not very good. I mean, I say that as somebody who loves the Last of Us games, particularly the first one. I think that the thing about it, though, that gives me a little bit of pause is that I do think that works perfectly well in the medium it's in already, and I know that there are video game fans who criticize The Last of Us for being that player choice does not have a lot of impact on what happens in The Last of Us. That though you are playing things in the game, I mean, obviously you are moving the story forward simply by like beating a portion of the game or something and moving forward. The narrative cannot really be adjusted in any way. You are always on a straight line from A to B, but that could actually make it easier to adapt into a TV show that's more satisfying. Maybe, I don't know.
But even then, you run into like the problem of, it's the problem I always had with the Watchmen adaptation, which is it exists. Mm-hmm. Like a very good version of this exists. So what is the point of replicating it with perfect fidelity? And it also, like, one of the things that makes The Last of Us great, and I will acknowledge that The Last of Us is a great video game.
Thank you, William.
Is that its structure is not, it's a zombie movie. Mm-hmm. It's a zombie movie that then there has been a lot of narrative work put into to examine tropes about humanity, but that's still like, it's still Max Payne to some extent. Part of what makes that special is that this is a really good zombie movie that you are the character in. Exactly. That
element of player involvement,
You bring up a really interesting point, though, William. You're talking about how that game is basically a zombie movie. Quite a few of these games are basically zombie movies, and then they're turned into zombie movies, and then there's a game based on the zombie movie. And you see that too, with like fighting games. Like when I'm watching something like Mortal Kombat, my main point of reference is something like a samurai movie or a kung fu movie, as opposed to a fighting video game. I think it's interesting how these kind of cinematic and video game genres talk to one another.
Yeah, even the old Anderson Mortal Kombat is basically just Enter the Dragon.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and you want to talk about the Resident Evil games. I mean, the Resident Evil games are so indebted to George Romero's zombie movies. I mean, they obviously go in a lot of other kooky, melodramatic directions over the years, and there's some sci-fi stuff in there. There's some aliens in there as well. But like, they are very indebted in their depiction of The Walking Dead to George Romero. So when they become movies, it's like two steps removed from the source in a way. You're basically making movies out of video games that are based on that draw heavily from movies.
Right.
Katie, I had a question for you because I think of you as an authority on sort of B movies to some extent. Are you very familiar with the works of Uwe Boll?
Enough, and I'm not really a fan. I don't feel like his heart is in the right place most of the time. I think that he is like actively kind of talking trash about the things he's making movies about. He made a movie called Blubberella, and I haven't really liked him very much ever since. And he's like a jerk in real life. So I'm not a fan. of
Yeah,
him.
I want to be clear. I am in no way, shape, or form a fan. I had not heard of Blubberella until I was doing research for this and learned that he used the exact same cast
Yeah,
from his
except
Blood
it's
Rain 3, but with a plus-sized actress.
Yeah, and he was not doing that from a place of love for the plus size
No.
community.
Absolutely not.
So.
Just an awful person, but a huge, weirdly huge influence on video game filmmaking for like 10 years.
I mean, he's made tons of them. I mean, he made one of the first.
I mean, more than any other living person, I think.
Is that true?
I would venture that is true. Yes.
I wonder how much of that is because a lot when we talk about Bull, I feel like people talk about him as somebody who is basically an opportunist in the sense that he can get people to fund these movies, and I wonder if it's intellectual property that he was able to get his hands on fairly easily. I wonder if that's the impetus because you're right, it doesn't ever feel watching his work. It doesn't ever feel and I should be clear, I've seen maybe like a couple of I saw the first two he made, House of the Dead and Alone in the Dark, which are both like totally abysmal. And neither of those seem like they're even especially interested in what people like about the games they're based on, you know?
Yeah, like the only, like, he doesn't seem to be making movies because he likes the material he's adapting. He doesn't even seem to like movies all that much. And so all I can figure is he's a film director because it's a great way to play petty power games. And I just don't respect that.
I don't know how true this is, but there's I think he said on one of the commentaries that for until like 2006, his movies were partially funded by a loophole in German tax law.
Yeah.
So he could make a movie and then get like half of his budget immediately back from the German government.
Yeah, I've heard that too. I've heard whispers of that like his film In the Name of the King, a dungeon siege tale, another video game adaptation, was very expensive, but I've heard tell that some people seem to think that was mostly a tax scam, essentially.
Yeah, I bring up Bull mostly because he is like it's impossible to deny that he has had a big. I think his work certainly influenced perceptions of video game movies for a while. That they were like, because he was literally just like shoveling these films out. House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, Blood Rain, Postal. These are not big game properties either for the most part, but they were video game movies. House of the Dead has the part where it switches into first person mode for about 5 minutes. But it's a situation where he is a more interesting / awful figure than any of his movies. And it's...
Yeah, it kind of seems like maybe it's a chicken egg situation where Uwe Boll got into video game movies because they were kind of, disposable and not especially artistic. And then the movies he's making is fueling that perception of video game movies. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Absolutely.
I will say, side note, it's very funny to me that his Wikipedia page, which I'm looking at right now, identifies him as a restaurateur before a filmmaker.
Yeah, apparently he has restaurants in, I think, Vancouver. I think they're doing okay. One of them closed. But
What an asshole.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he is like the most like mercenary of filmmakers in a lot of respects. But I do think that if you want to look at video game cinema auteurs, if such a thing exists, you have to look at him and you have to look at Anderson. They're sort of the night and day there, and I don't really think there's any contest in terms of the actual filmmaking,
Yeah, I think Anderson is actually enjoying his work and doing it because he enjoys it. And like William, you talked about B movies. To me, that is often what delineates a good B movie from a bad B movie, is if it was made with fun, let's put on a show guys kind of intentions, or if it's put on with cynical tax shelter exploitative kind of intentions.
Yeah, I mean, like, enthusiasm for the form can make up for actually quite a lot. I mean,
a lot.
Yeah, which is not to say that there aren't tons of hacks who are very excited about filmmaking who are also awful at it. But I think that even that base level of being invested in what you're doing and trying to make it fun or cool or exciting is going to make some difference, And
I think it shows.
And to be clear, I don't think Anderson is a hack. I think he is somebody who works almost exclusively in pulp. I don't think all of his movies work, but I do have an affection for some of them. I actually really like one of his non-video game films, which is Event Horizon. Although, again,
yes!
That to me feels a little inspired by video game aesthetics, a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah, when I first saw Event Horizon, I was like, okay, so Paul W.S. Anderson was like, what if Alien, but big and loud and dumb? And I was like, I can't, wholly condemn that because it was big and loud and fun and dumb.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Okay, so this is my question at this point in the conversation, which is that are we ever going to see at any point the kind of I'll call it the Dark Knight of video game adaptations, the one that brings real prestige and respectability and maybe even a real sense of ambition to this particular adaptation genre?
I've spent a lot of since I saw this originally in the show outline, I have really tried to think about this question, and I think the answer ends up being no, which is and I don't mean that as like a condemnation of the genre. It's I guess I don't know what that looks like is the problem. Is that I can sit here and try to think about, and you can say, well, before the Dark Knight, did you know what that would look like? But I don't know if many of these stories are stories that demand respectability. Is that I worry that I'm damning an entire art form here with my words, but I don't think being taken seriously is the thing that is wrong about video game movies.
Right.
Okay. Kind of takes me back to something that you said, Dowd, that really sticks out to me, which is that, it's missing a key element, which is the interactive element. And so, like maybe it's just not possible to have a fully satisfying video game adaptation because it is like missing a key piece.
I do think that it's always going to be taking something that's maybe already in its ideal medium and moving it to another one. I also think that Hollywood's relentless push to exploit IP is sort of what, for me, is what it is sort of at the center of why a lot of these projects don't work, is that I don't think there's any vision behind them. I think a lot of them, it's really just about, can we take this thing and make some more money off of it in a new medium. That being said, I don't know if I think it's impossible that we will eventually get somebody who is a real visionary who says, I think I can make a really amazing movie from the blueprint of this game, and I think it'll just take somebody who is genuinely interested in doing that, somebody who actually is no offense to, like, say, Duncan Jones, who I think actually is a good filmmaker, but Warcraft got away from him, one might say. But I do think that if the right person came along and decided, I think I see something here and I can make something out of it, I think we could at least see one that's really good in the way that none of them have been at this point. And I suspect that if it were good enough, it would push back against some of the sort of general critical and cultural perception of video game movies as fundamentally trash,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to source material as much as the person making it. Like, you look at The Dark Knight, like a lot of the themes and the ideas that Nolan pulled out for that movie were built into Batman and were built into the character of the Joker. Mm-hmm. Batman is a character who is about public responsibility and vengeance and surveillance and all these different things. Mario's not about anything. Mario is nothing. Like, and I say that as someone who loves Mario deeply, but Mario, there is no theme. Like, if you try to play, I would say, any Mario game and ask yourself, what's the theme here? It's jumping.
I don't know, Will. I think that Mario is about colonialism, and I think it's about the gig economy, I think, also.
Excuse me, Dad. It's a classic immigrant story of two Italian plumbers moving to a land that desperately needs plumbing.
No, I very much take your point. And I do think that some of the more ambitious games in terms of what they're trying to do thematically have yet to be made into movies. I mean, I still think that, like, I'm surprised we haven't seen a Metal Gear movie yet, because I think those games are very big and silly in a lot of ways, but they are grappling with some real things. I think that if there were an action filmmaker who decided they wanted to make a serious and interesting and thoughtful Metal Gear movie, I think it could happen,
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
I think you could absolutely, if you locked Hideo Kojima in a room and didn't let him touch anything involved with it. And I say that as a man who likes his games, but
yeah.
I think there is certainly a way to take those parts and make an entertaining movie. And again, I don't want to, like, stump as the world's greatest Prince of Persia Sands a Time fan, but I think that is a model where that is as close as you're going to get to like making, like, you know, you put Alfred Molina in a movie and have him do some funny stuff. It feels like a movie, I guess is my point, that particular film.
Yeah.
In a way that a lot of video game movies feel like a compromise.
Right.
And I think that that's probably the approach that could get us closest to some kind of course, what I'm saying here is cut away all the video game parts.
And just
so what's the
embrace
point?
you're right, yeah. And just embrace the cinematic elements entirely.
Yeah.
Okay, so brass tacks. Let's get down to it. We've talked a lot about the many bad video game adaptations that there are, and we barely touched on some of the really bad ones, and even some of the ones that I think are somewhat inexplicably half acclaimed, like something like Silent Hill. But I want to know now at this point what each of you think is the best video game adaptation. So, Katie, let's start with you.
I really like the 1995 Mortal Kombat. Like I said, I'm a tourist. You know, I'm barely scratching the surface of this world, but I thought it was like it because, as William pointed out, it is basically Enter the Dragon. It was in a bucket that I recognized, and I loved the temple in it, where it was like half haunted house, half like Thai, jungle ruin, which I thought was pretty cool. And there's so many skeletons in that movie. It had like skeletons and speed metal, and like what's his name? Cage was a dick, but that's okay. And I liked Goro. I just felt like it had like kind of a low stakes adventure kind of vibe to it, even though it is Mortal Kombat, and the stakes are very high.
It does embrace the silliness of that material in a way that's kind of fun. I remember liking. It's been a long time since I've seen Anderson's Mortal Kombat, but I remember liking it in '95 while still feeling like it should have been rated R. I was like, it's Mortal Kombat.
Sure.
We should be seeing people get their heads ripped off and stuff. But I did remember enjoying like Sub-Zero and Scorpion, and the effects now look like, I'm sure they look like just like hideously primitive at this point. But in '95, they were chintzy but fun, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it had some practical effects. I'm going to go back once again to Goro, who I feel like got done dirty in this new movie. We'll talk about that on a bonus episode. But after seeing the '95 one, I was like, this character is awesome. And you had, a guy wearing a suit on top of his head, so he looked like he had 4 arms. And yeah, that kind of stuff was I would agree that it's more of the PG-13 of it all gives it more of like a fantasy adventure Indiana Jones vibe than maybe the game has, but I still appreciated that.
I think you can definitely say about it, and you can say it about most of Anderson's films, it is not ashamed to be a Mortal Kombat movie.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep. It is definitely not ashamed to be. It has that amazing techno version of the Mortal Kombat theme.
I loved that part. I loved that part. And halfway through the film, when like the kind of you have our heroes fighting a bunch of ninjas run in the room for the first time to fight our heroes, and somebody off screen yells Mortal Kombat. I was like, this is great. This is so fun. I'm having so much fun right now.
Oh, that's funny. I feel like no movie that has Christopher Lambert as an ageless thunder god can be all bad,
Yeah, that was wild too. His whole performance was very wild.
Talk about a guy who understands the assignment, No
kidding.
Absolutely.
All right, William, so what about you? Favorite video game adaptation?
So the tricky thing here is that in terms of like movies I like, I'm more likely to say movies that have been deeply informed by video games. Like you look like, Wreck-It Ralph is a really fun movie, or Scott Pilgrim, or Hardcore Henry, or Jake Kasdan's Jumanji movies, which are very informed and about video games, but aren't adaptations.
You're right. Yeah, Jumanji really is informed by video games. Yeah, even the idea of the characters going into different, player bodies.
Can I pedantically complain about something in the first Jumanji film, though, the first
Please
of the rebooted films? Why are we getting scenes with the bad guys when the players are not around? That makes no sense. They're not coded as cutscenes because other things in the movie are coded as cutscenes. Why would we be seeing their perspective? Why would they even have a perspective that we could cut to if it's a video game? It makes no sense.
I mean, the practical answer is because some executive said, "Who's this guy?"
Right. Like in a video game world, I guess it's changed over the years now that we have these vast sandbox worlds where technically, even if you're not looking at something is supposedly still happening, like NPCs are going through little pre-planned routes, even if you're not, even if they're not in direct line of vision. But so maybe that's a good excuse. But it just feels like in a video game world, especially one that's sort of supposed to be slightly more primitive in that sense, a villain would not exist if they are not in your line of sight. Anyway, I'm being very pedantic, but
but correct, technically correct, best kind of correct. My answer, if we're talking about straight adaptations, again, I've already complained about the plotting, but I felt genuine, like a sense of a little bit, at least, of awe and wonder watching Detective Pikachu and being like, oh my god, they actually made a world where like humans and Pokemon hang out, and the Pokemon all look right, and I just want to watch a movie about hanging out in this world, and there's no weird Bill Nighy sci-fi plot happening in the background.
Well, there is there's a connection between that and Wreck-It Ralph, which you mentioned, which is this sort of notion that like it would be fun if there was a world where these various video game characters were just all kind of interacting, Mm-hmm. I think my pick, I will say I have some affection for, I have not seen all of Anderson's Resident Evil films, and I know that some of those are actually very well regarded, at least by the vulgar tourist crowd,
Mm-hmm.
But I do like the first one, which has some, I love that there's a scene in the first one that involves a sort of booby-trapped room with moving lasers that, again, has nothing to do with Resident Evil. There's nothing like that in any of the Resident Evil games, but it's really fun in the movie. But I think my answer, honestly, is Rampage, the Dwayne Johnson film from a few years ago. Enormously silly movie with some really, really wild tonal whiplash. I mean, this is a film that, and I wrote this in the review at the time, that features a scene where there's like emergency workers rushing around Chicago and there's a lot of wreckage, and it's immediately like evoking 9/11, and then they cut to like a giant monkey doing the universal hand gesture for sex. And that's like Rampage in a nutshell,
And that's an interesting example, too, because, I mean, you want to talk about not having much to work with. I've played the arcade game Rampage.
Right.
And, like, there's really, it's just monkey go up building, destroy building. Like, Godzilla destroy building. There's really not a lot to it.
Yeah, it's just, wouldn't it be fun to be a kaiju? Kind of.
Which it would.
Yeah.
Absolutely it would.
Well, what I like about Rampage is that it actually does kind of capture the lizard brain appeal of those games while also working, at least to some extent, as a movie. I mean, it's a profoundly stupid film in a number of ways, but I can't say that it doesn't deliver on what it promises. I mean, it is... the kaiju action in that movie is occasionally actually sort of casually horrifying. Like, you watch Katie and I, we recently talked about the Godzilla franchise, and we talked about the recent Godzilla movies and how they're maybe kind of a little squeamish about showing actual death, and we find ways like, maybe we could find a way to almost depopulate the city so that Godzilla isn't stomping all over humans. Rampage is like every few minutes there's a scene where we're either seeing people die on screen or just mass off-screen death, and I actually kind of admired it. The 10-year-old in me admired that about it.
Yeah, those are games where like a lot of the appeal is literally eating people, like reaching in and eating people.
Yeah. All right, big thanks to William Hughes for being our guest this week. That's all we've got for you on Film Club, but please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blomberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Zach Goldsboro, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. And if you enjoyed this week's episode, there's a special bonus episode up on the site this week where we talk about the new Mortal Kombat movie that is now in theaters and available on HBO Max. It's me, Katie, and William just talking about that film. Otherwise, we're off for the next few weeks, but we will be back soon with brand new episodes of Film Club. Thanks for listening.
Bye.